On the 10th of April 1912, the Titanic set sail from Southampton. The ship was on her maiden voyage to New York City, where from berth 44 from Southampton docks, the trip would take 7 days. But with a journey like Titanic's, what food would her passengers have had on board? In this mini-series, we are going to be showing and discussing what foods that were served in all 3 classes. This is Le Restaurant Titanic. In 1912, a first-class menu had been sent to a Southampton home while the ship the menu came from was sailing towards her destination, New York City. The menu, dated the 10th of April, was sent from Queenstown Island back to Southampton by first-class steward Charles Caswell. Caswell's wife, Hilda, was the first person who received the menu, which contained the evening meals that was served to first-class passengers when the ship, the RMS Titanic, was docked in Cherbourg, France. While Hilda received the souvenir from her husband, Charles tragically perished in the sinking. While the menus are distant memories of the past, the food on board the Titanic is infamous for its presentation and extreme deliciousness. There have been many YouTube channels that have recreated recipes that were made on board. This includes Tasting History with Max Miller, who recreated meals and retold stories of the passengers and crew in this mini-series for Titanic Month.
Oh, weird. Interesting. So the mace really hits you first. It's that and the chicken stock. Those are the dominant flavors.
While it is the cherry on top of the cake, there haven't been a lot of videos that have covered the full dining experience. This is about to change. In this mini-series, we will be sitting down at the dinner table, and in each episode, we are looking into all of the restaurants and saloons on board the Titanic. We are also going to be looking into the stories of those who worked behind the scenes to recreate these meals and the passengers who sat down to enjoy them. In the early 20th century, British shipping lanes competed with Germany, who were dominating the North Atlantic waves with their bigger and newer ocean liners. By May 1911, the White Star liner, the RMS Titanic, had her time to shine when she was launched into the River Lagan. The Titanic was to be the biggest liner, but rather than focusing on her speed, the company she belonged to wanted to concentrate on luxury and comfort. This included food preparations, which were to be the grandest meals on board an ocean liner. Titanic's owner, the White Star Line, had a reputation for building ships to give their customers superior comfort and luxury, particularly for first-class passengers. In June 1911, during the voyage of the Titanic's sister ship, the RMS Olympic, over 1,300 passengers boarded her. However, she was under capacity, as the first of the Olympic-class trio could have carried 2,435 passengers. Despite this, Thomas Andrews, the ship designer at the Harlander Wharf shipping yard, had recorded notes on possible improvements for the Olympic. Andrews would do the same on the Titanic's maiden voyage. With Andrews' notes and in the hopes of making improvements, the White Star Line would offer first-class extensive facilities with the latest technologies and extravagantly decorated interiors in the styles of the British country manor, luxury hotel and Louis Seize. These traditional styles would have been located around A to C decks and additional first-class rooms. The Titanic and the Olympic were the first British ships to feature restaurants that were separate from their main dining saloons. On board, the rooms include the Vendera Cafe, the Café Parisien, the a la carte restaurant and the dining saloon. All of these rooms would have been luxurious whether they were visited in full daylight or at night, and they must have attracted those who would have come to dine or would have worked there. Following the sinking of the Titanic, a selection of menus was either recovered by the Titanic's passengers or found in random places. One menu was found on the back of a framed picture before it was given to an antique gallery in Texas. Some of them were later sold in auction houses worldwide, with the most expensive being the first-class luncheon menu dated the 14th of April 1912, which sold for $88,000 in September 2015. The food mentioned in all three classes' menus was made by the victualling department. The department consisted of a series of galleys that would prepare food and beverages for the passengers and crew. During the Titanic's voyage, the victualling department was considered the largest department on board. Although there were more 500 crew members on board, the people who worked in the galleries and the bakery consisted of nearly 160 staff members. This included 113 cooks, with 15 first cooks, 12 pastry chefs, 6 bakers, 5 butchers, and 5 sous chefs. In charge of them and the menus was the head chef Charles Proctor. At the time of the Titanic's voyage, Proctor had been working on the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, possibly from a return voyage to Southampton. As a chef, he would have received a monthly wage of £20, around $2,300 or $2,840 in today's money. Because of his monthly wages, Proctor became the high-payest crew member on board the ship after Captain Edward Smith. Proctor embarked on board the Titanic on the 2nd of April 1912, and once the ship arrived in Southampton, Proctor had an unfortunate situation where, because of technical difficulties on board the ship in the restaurant galley, the hot press stopped working. Luckily, the situation was resolved before the ship left berth 44 on the 10th. Proctor only worked on the D-deck galley, which served the first and second-class dining saloons. But he wasn't alone, for alongside him was baker Charles Jocklin, Charles Kennel, Titanic's only kosher or Hebrew cook, and cooks Isaac Maynard and Harold Stubbings. These men worked on the D-deck galley, which served the first and second-class dining saloons. The galley included rooms for silver and china and storage bins for the tons of coal to fuel the ship's 19 ovens, rangers, and roasters. It also had a bakery, vegetable kitchens, a butcher shop, and rooms for wines, beer, and oysters. They had to work around the clock as there was a tight timetable of when meals had to be prepared and served on time. They would work 15-hour shifts from 10 a.m. to 11 p.m, so you can imagine how tiring it must have been for the cooks. All the food was recorded in the poulterer's logbook, which would have been in the hands of Chief Officer Henry Wilde, who would have been responsible for recording the amount of supplies that were to be taken on board. There is a surviving logbook which can be viewed in the Sea City Museum in Southampton. In the logbook, there are page lists for both the Titanic and the Olympic. Dating around April 1912, the logbook records the meats that were brought on board, including 864 rabbits, golden plover, and ducks. It isn't known which companies supplied the food for the ship, but it is likely that the companies would have been from Southampton or further afield. What we do know is that after the food was brought to port, the 500 tons of cargo would have been collected at port in Southampton docks and would have been stored at the correct temperature in separate rooms on G-deck. In dedication to the foods on G-deck, the ship would have had over 20 rooms based on categories. These would include rooms for milk and butter, bacon, ham and cheese and meat, vegetables, fish, mutton, and ice cream. There were even 3 rooms for ice, ice cream, and ice-making machines. For some of the food that had been stored, the Titanic had carried over 75,000 libels of meat, 11,000 libels of fresh fish, 40,000 fresh eggs and 1,500 gallons of milk. To transport the food from the storage rooms to the galleys, the staff would have travelled into these rooms through a system of elevators to the first and second class galleys. For the third class galley, the staff would have to walk over it from the other two galleys from G to F decks. The first and second class galleys would have been located on D deck. When it came to the preparations before serving the meals, Proctor and his employees would have taken inspiration from the recipes written by authors including journalist Isabella Beeton with various charus recipes and French chef and restaurateur Auguste Escoffier. Escoffier's recipes were the influence that made French cuisine the fare of first-class society. Although Escoffier never boarded the Titanic, the food that Proctor would have made sure that the meals would have been presentable like the dishes served at the Ritz Hotel. When it came to the dining table, the main room that would have accommodated first-class passengers would have been the dining saloon. Titanic's first-class dining saloon was located on the same deck and it was next door to the first and second-class galleys on D deck. The saloon itself would have accommodated 554 passengers. Inside, the saloon would have been decorated with wooden paneling and painted white, and the floors would be covered in blue tiles featuring elaborate patterns, and there were 115 tables that would accommodate between 2 to 12 people. As well as serving food, the saloon would have been the place for hosting Anglican church services, which took place on the morning of Sunday the 14th of April. The saloon would have had timetables for when meals were served. The meals would start as early as 7 a.m. for breakfast and finishing as late as 8:15 p.m. for dinner. And to address when the meals were ready, an announcement would have been made by a bugle to a tune called The Roast Beef of Old England.
One mighty roast beef was the Englishman's food. It ennobled our veins and enriched our blood. Our soldiers were brave and our courtiers were good. Oh, the roast beef of old England and old English roast beef.
The man who would play the instrument would have been Peter W. Fletcher. Fletcher's life is a little mystery considering there's no record of him sailing for the first time or if he worked with the White Star Line before the Olympic. What we do know is that Fletcher worked as a bugler on board the Olympic before signing on to the ship in Belfast on the 1st of April 1912 for the Titanic's delivery trip to Southampton. He then signed on again as a steward in Southampton on the 4th. Dining in the saloon, receiving the dining experiences and the services from stewards and the food by the chefs would have been similar to those that customers would have received in European hotels like the Ritz in the City of London. And the food in the dining saloon would have been exotic and exciting. Revealed in silver dishes by White Star Line stewards, passengers would have had an 11-course meal and they would have been given other options to alternate their meals. The options were either kosher or vegetarian meals. Breakfast meals would have included poached salmon, baked potatoes, and a choice of cereals. Lunch meals would have been grilled mutton chops, potted shrimp, and custard pudding. On the night of the 14th of April, first-class passengers would have tucked into a parade of hearty meals, which were enjoyed by Elizabeth Eustace and Martha Stevenson. The meals were so good that their steward gave them several souvenir menus. However, Marguerite Stellini recalls how the food didn't matter too much. She and her mother had suffered from seasickness from the 11th of April, and their stomachs had only settled on that night. After eating, the seasickness had returned and she immediately returned to her cabin. Some of the other guests who would dine the saloon would be Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews Jr., Isidore and Ida Strauss, Lucian and Mary Smith, Jack Thayer, and depending on how they were rated, the food included spring lamb with mint jelly, oysters, poached salmon, and roast duckling. The passengers were also treated to various champagnes and cocktails by the bartenders, including a Robert Burns cocktail served with a side of shortbread cookies. But the popular items on the menu were the desserts. One of the desserts was punch romaine, which was a sorbet that was served as a palate cleanser. At 11:40 p.m., while the wine and cheese courses were continuing to be served, the Titanic struck the iceberg. Next time, we will be looking into the a la carte restaurant and the first-class menu.